Hello, welcome everyone to this fourth and last day of summer school. I am Ursula Costantini, Economic Affairs Officer, the Globalization and Development Strategies Division in UNCTAD. This is the sixth panel of the summer school, and it's titled The Future of Industrial Policy. And the distinguished speaker, we have Professor Ebru Voyvoda, who joins us from the Middle Eastern Technical University in Ankara, Turkey. She, by the way, used to work at UNCTAD before she left us for academia. And she's also has been for a long time a consultant and a collaborator of us on topics precisely of industrial policy. Thank you very much, Ebru, for coming. As a discussant, there's my senior colleague, Rashmi Banga, here with us. She is from the South-South Cooperation Unit in our division, the division that, together with the Young Scholar Initiative of INET, organizes this summer school. She's our trade and industrial policy expert in our division. Thank you very much as well for being here. Please give the floor to Professor Voyvoda.
Thank you, Ursula. And could you just remind me when I have like 5 or 6 minutes? Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, of course, I should start by thanking UNCTAD GDS and the Young Scholars Initiative of INET for not only organizing this, but making me a part of this event, which I think is will be beneficial for every one of us. Well, I should say I remember it was almost 20 years ago, and I've been telling this to people that I've joined Ha-Joon Chang's Cambridge Summer School, and it has an immense impact on my own research agenda, what my research interests were. And I do see from your participation, from our meetings here and there and conversations here and there, that you guys are benefiting and contributing to this environment, which is really great. So we should thank the organizers for that. Okay, so well, they say that it's the last day, last session, it's going to be hard, but at the same time, it's going to be easy because kind of my presentation, or the presentation that I prepared, is kind of a summary of what you guys have been discussing and what we have been discussing over the last couple of days. So I think I would like to make 3 points to which I feel like that have been discussed immensely. So the first point that I would like to go through is actually so the revival, the discussion about the current revival of industrial policy. Okay. There we go. Okay, perfect. So the first point I would like to emphasize once more is perhaps the revival of the discussion of industrial policy, the current debates, and actually for whom, right? So if you are a close follower of the UNCTAD's trade and development reports, you're going to find a lot of indicators about the situation of the global economy in the post-2007-9 global financial crisis, right? Because the global economy since then is basically defined by low growth rates, slowdown in productivity growth, especially in the core countries or northern countries, weak investment dynamics and behavior, continuous and high unemployment rates, stagnant real wages, decreasing wage shares, all these exacerbated by multidimensional inequalities, right? So we kind of discussed that, we've been discussing this under the term new normal or secular stagnation. Now we're seeing in the last couple of years the exacerbating effects of the pandemic, the uncertainties and risks now deepened by the conflict of the Ukraine. And now we have to we kind of, or the world economy is now kind of faced with this multi-dimensional socioeconomic challenges, let's put it that way, right? So I've basically chosen two indicators. One is the long-term GDP growth, which you might have seen different versions of that. And of course, it's very volatile, marking the global recessions and the downturns and what have you. But in order to be able to trace the averages, I kind of had this averages with the horizontal lines, or mark with the horizontal lines, that what we're experiencing is actually not only the growth that we have is serving its purpose of whatever purpose we have, whatever purpose it has for developing economies, but it's also slowing down in terms of the rates of growth, or in terms of the measures that we have at it, right? So this has been taking place for a long time. And the second indicator I find really informative in that sense is the productivity, right? So if you're going to grow, you're going to have some form, somehow you have to have some productivity growth going on. So this is for the major economies, France, Germany, Japan, UK, and the USA. And don't let USA fool you, because this is productivity growth per hours worked. So during the times of the crisis and the COVID, because the number of hours worked goes down, you seem to have these hikes about labor productivity, but no, right? So we see, well, it might be a bit messy here, but I think a summary we could find over here, that this is the productivity growth since 1990s for the G7 countries and the OECD countries in general, which has really dipped during the financial crisis, but not recovered since then, right? So in terms of what generates growth and what stimulates growth and what keeps it sustainable, we certainly have some problem, right? So I think one of the reasons why we see so much of a stimulated debate on industrial policy, we should look into through these indicators. So that's the first thing, or that's the first dimension, although it's quite multifaceted, right? So the second thing is what we've been immensely discussing and talking for the last 2 days or so, right? Which is another crisis, or another challenge. It's the challenge of global warming. So we're basically having this increase in the global emissions. This is carbon dioxide emissions. You can extend it to greenhouse gas emissions, which has now reached to the order of almost 40 gigaton per year, which then, compared to the global budget, which Professor Grubb was mentioning, well, he kind of in a way chosen to mention the 2 degrees Celsius figures. But if you look at the latest IPCC reports, the 6th assessment report, or 1.5 degrees special report, the global carbon budget, which means, right, the total amount of carbon that we can emit to the atmosphere before it gets really chaotic, is like at most 40 gigatons. And if you are annually producing 400 gigatons, I'm sorry. So, well, we have a global carbon budget of, so if you would really want to make it seriously, you can say that, well, we have 8 to 10 years before everything gets chaotic, right? So, of course, how to allocate this budget in an equitable and just way is a major question, and there's a major literature on that, looking into different kind of indicators, different characterizations of an equitable, just and equitable, responsible sharing of this burden. But then that's another issue that we can talk about, because it also, the way that it is approached also encompasses great inequalities among the countries. So in a way, we're facing, you know, what we have been calling the polycrisis, multidimensional crisis. On the one hand, the socioeconomic challenges. On the other hand, the challenge that's deepened by, or that's extended by, the global warming. And what comes out of this as a way to tackle, but as a way to also stimulate the ground of productivity that's been lost for some decades right now, is through these green deals, right? Or somehow the green policies. Well, we have to remember that actually the discussions about these new Green Deals were not actually very mainstream, or were not actually coming from the EU, the United States administration, what have you, but it was coming, in fact, as a reaction to the 2007-9 global financial crisis, that it was a large-scale movement that found itself in the socialist groups, the labor unions, in a way in the policy design of the Labour Party in the UK, and then the manifesto of this Representative Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Edward Markey in the United States, that it was basically started to be discussed as a manifesto, emphasizing or recognizing that the climate change is fundamentally a class issue, and it's a product of this broken economic system that we live in, and economic, social, and climate justice are to be indissoluble in a way that we have to tackle them all together. And then it was proposing green industrial revolution. You can find many documents and pamphlets out there. But what we see today is kind of a mainstreaming of this green industrial revolution idea, and actually putting industrial policy at the focus of this green transition, so that we have an environment, or we have a revival of the economic system that we live in, and that source coming from the global north. So the current debates, if you look at the current debates, if you look at Financial Times, Economist, and the other sources, the revival of this green industrial policy is basically shaped by these debates. And you see the mainstreaming of this in the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. But before that, the American Jobs Program, the American Families Program, and all those acts and programs that were initiated before that. We see it in the Green Deal Industrial Plan, or the Net Zero Industrial Act of the EU. But if you look at the documents, their source is basically coming from tackling this green transformation issue, global warming issue, having a new way to grow and stimulate growth, make it a sustainable growth for the global economy. But also it focuses on this unfair competition from China and the Chinese trade. It focuses on this innovation drought. It focuses on rethinking state role in the context of developed economies. And it really focuses and emphasizes that we need green transition, or these countries need green transition, and as a source of rapid and drastic transformation of the economies. And when you look at the industrial policy, the reflection of these ideas on the industrial policy documents, if you go to the Inflation Reduction Act, if you go to Net Zero Industry Act, well, you see phrases like dependence on imports for new clean manufacturing technologies. It says we have to get rid of this dependence. We need to have industrial transformation at home. We need to be preserving countries' rightful place in the global hierarchical order. It has to be domestic economic development. It has to be serving the strategic autonomy of the country. It has the importance in terms of investing in technological sovereignty. You really need to identify the path dependence in terms of technological innovations. Hence, we need active industrial policy. We need long-term economic prosperity, hence government's active involvement, what have you. So, but they're not really talking about, and we have to remember that they're not really focusing on market asymmetries, informational asymmetries, imperfect competition, the role of the state in terms of regulating the markets, what have you. But these sentences are like the sentences that are reminiscent of the development and the industrial and the role of industrial policy in terms of development in the past that were really discussed in the context of the developing economies and the future path of the developing economies. So in a way, are we going to, or the developing economies, will they be embracing this situation and the change in discourse? Or is it really serving? And whatever the policy tools that are out there, is it really serving for development? I think it's an important question, because I think what is left, or what is really described as the position of developing countries here in this context, is not much promising for the developing economies, right? Because actually, when you look at the tools, and when you look at the policy promises or the policy conclusions arising out of these seemingly developmental discourse, that's a discourse for advanced economies. And the future that comes out of this discourse for the developing economies seems to me yet another path of dependence through technology transfers, through pressures on adopting and being the importers of this new set of ideas, right? So of course, this is very much in line with what we have been observing in terms of the industrialization and deindustrialization trends, not only in developed economies. So this graph shows the manufacturing value added share relative to that of the advanced economies, relative to that of the G7 in many developing regions. And so the dotted red line is actually one, which means if the region's share is above that, the share of manufacturing in GDP is actually higher than that of the advanced economies. So what we see as a trend really since 1970 is actually many developing countries' manufacturing value added share is actually becoming higher and higher and increasing and becoming higher than that of the advanced economies, which is of course, although some regions like Sub-Saharan Africa are still below that, which is of course an end result of immense deindustrialization in the advanced world through this period. So it's the very first line that you see over on the table. So the developed economies' manufacturing value added share has been actually on a steady decline, somewhere around 26.4%, coming down to 14% before the pandemic, let's say. But then if you look at the numbers for the developing regions and selected countries, such as Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Mexico, South Africa, Turkey, what have you, what you observe is also an immense trend for deindustrialization in these countries as well. So it's not really the advanced economy is deindustrializing and then the developing regions are industrializing and taking advantage of what we call the structural transformation. It's actually, we are observing many developing regions deindustrializing as well, despite this huge change of geography of industrial production. And the story, as we all know, is that this geography turns out to be the East Asia, China in particular. But then when the rest of the developing regions were deindustrializing along with the industrial world, in fact, these economies, despite their struggles, despite their unique experiences, that geography turns out to be the one that has managed to pull an industrialization episode, and hence all the policy discussions that we have been doing today. So that's the first thing, how we should, the point I wanted to make, how we should think about the conceptualization of the revival of industrial policy in the current characteristics of the global economy. So the second point I want to make is actually something that we've been discussing again. So in this context, how we should be rethinking about industrial policy for developing economies, right? So yesterday, it was Professor Grubb mentioned the theoretical foundations of thinking about industrial policy for climate change or for green transition. And he actually listed 3 theoretical foundations in order to be able to basically start discussing about industrial policy making for green transition. So he cited behavioral and organizational economics, neoclassical welfare economics, and evolutionary in institutional economics, well, I think we need to, in the context of industrial policy for developing economies, I think we need to add the fourth theoretical foundation, which is the classical development economics, because actually we're still asking the question of development, right? So it's basically, there is also a revival of industrial policy, industrialization in the developing economy context as well. And I think the reasons for that is of course having these commonalities with the reasons why we observe this discussion in the advanced economies, but also in the conditions that are unique to developing economies as well, right? So the growth strategies under neoliberal globalization is not really serving what it's supposed to serve. The growth paths of the developing economies, we now associate with all these different types of lock-ins, right? We talk about growth, middle income trap, we talk about commodity dependence trap, we talk about premature deindustrialization and the traps that are associated with it, right? We observe the continuing vulnerability of many developing countries to external shocks, real and financial shocks. We observe the culmination of these vulnerabilities, the new challenges brought by all these new conditions of pandemic and energy conflicts and all that, right? And then we now, right, with the onset of the climate change pressure as well, we now in a situation, or the developing countries as well, are now in the recognition of transformation that looks into sectoral dependencies, that looks into critical inputs, and therefore we see a revival of industrial policy debate in the context of development as well, right? So, but exacerbated now under the conditions of current challenges and opportunities. So I'm going to show you a couple of, well, I have highlighted here the growth strategies or the growth paths under neoliberal globalization. And I think the country that I'm from, Turkey, serves as a perfect example of not having any strategy at all, leaving the ground to the capital inflows, enjoying overvalued exchange rates that comes with it, enjoying debt-driven growth, enjoying all these benefits of financialization. And what happened, as many regions in the world perhaps, is that the manufacturing base that it has built up over the decades with so hardship, with so much policy, what have you, has been now on a declining trend. A perfect example of premature deindustrialization. That's basically, in terms of current prices, it's the blue line. But if you also look at the red line, it's in constant prices, which also shows you, and the gap also tells you that the price of the average price of the manufacturing sector is also lagging behind that of services and agriculture. So it gives you an idea about how a developing country, a semi-industrialized developing country, actually, if it leads itself into recessively integrating with the global labor division, with the global labor division, how it loses its industry base. Well, we talk about structural transformation. Despite this deindustrialization, if you look at the export dynamics of the country, well, it doesn't look like South Korea, of course, but it is not bad, right? So we see some transformation from agricultural exports and agricultural and food exports having the major share at the beginning. And then, as you expect from a structural transformation and development, it is basically replaced by higher shares of textiles, and then goes into, and eventually and recently goes into machinery, automobiles, medium to high tech sectors. But this is the export shares, right? So when you look at this, the same figure in terms of net exports, we see that it's basically the only sector that contributes positively to the current account balance of the country is textiles, right? So this is a way to rethink, on an example, to rethink about structural transformation, not only in terms of structural transformation, in terms of exports per se, but in terms of the linkages that you need to construct and you don't need to lose. In fact, you shouldn't be losing within the domestic economy in terms of the inputs, in terms of the intermediate flows, in terms of the incomes, in terms of the learning linkages that it might bring you, right? So as I was focusing on, right, and as you have been discussing a lot, the four, perhaps the theoretical foundations that we need to go back, if it's a question of development, it's basically, right, the classical developmental literature, the industrial policy for development, what it means for the industrial policy for development, because actually if we really stick to the current discourse of the advanced economies and the revival of the industrial policy debate, then we really stick to thinking in terms of taxes and subsidies, R&D, innovation, and all that. But if we go back to how the leading role of the state was defined back in those days, back in those literature, right, in terms of coordinating and cooperating and managing the power relations, the conflicts that could arise, in terms of public investment, in terms of fiscal space, in terms of policy space. If you look at the industrial policy as a tool of not only independence, but interdependence in terms of a tool to systematically reduce the global imbalances. And if we look at the discussions about the South-South cooperation, as my colleagues here work for, or work on, it's basically the literature that perhaps we need to revisit in the context of the current debates. So I'm not going to read it. How much time do I have? Okay, then. Now, I'm just going to remind you the key points of this literature that I find important. Of course, you have a large literature, large list of references that you could look at. First is the role of manufacturing and industrialization in terms of this structural transformation, in terms of how we should be defining industrial policy. So the second one is the role of the state and calling for an active state, and not only in terms of the constrained set of tax and subsidy and R&D and innovation policies, but beyond that, and also targeted and tailored with respect to the unique conditions of each and every economy, with respect to institutional capacities, with respect to management of dualities and conflicts that are going to arise or that will be arising through this transformation process. And then the interdependence and linkages. So what I'll try to do in the next couple of minutes is I'll try to really try to give this meat and bone in terms of the green transition discussions that we have been doing. So in terms of structural transformation, right? So the development and the economic development requires structural change, not only from low productivity to high productivity activities, but also diversifying, adopting, being able to build capacities and abilities, right? And that should be a dynamic one and not only be a one that's based on static comparative advantages. So how do we need to, or how we should be interpreting the idea of structural transformation in the context of green transition today, right? So what I think is transformation of the energy system. So we're talking about high-tech technologies, all these green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, CCS technologies that Professor Grubb discussed yesterday. But what I think is could be in terms of this structural transformation and green transition, an important starting point for many developing countries is to look into the energy systems. Why am I saying that? Because actually the transformation of energy systems is relatively more feasible than the transformation of the whole manufacturing system, than the transformation of the production technologies, especially for developing economies that do not have the base yet, right? So, but the transformation of the energy system is relatively giving a ground for losing a latecomer advantage at the moment. So there is this cost advantage of the renewables electricity production through solar and wind that have been emphasized a couple of times in this summer school. These are already available, mature technologies. There's this issue that it can solve through energy security. These are called manufactured technologies in the way that it's not just the oil and gas, but you have to manufacture them. There's role for the SMEs, there's role for employment opportunities, and there are a lot of co-benefits, linkages to the other sectors of the economy that you can make use of. So I think this might be energy system transition could be one starting point for many developing countries to think about the role of industrial policy and structural transformation. Second one is state capacity and the active involvement of the state. Now, of course, this is a very hard topic to think about. But again, I think the transformation, because we know that the transformation to low carbon economy demands a state capacity for policy design, right? For the management, in order to manage the conflicts, in order to manage the dualities, in order to manage the power relations and all that. For what I see in Turkey, and I think it could be valid for a bunch of other developing economies that have been thinking about this green transition as well, is that for the first time, for a long period for the first time in decades perhaps, there's a coordination, there's a need for coordination among ministries that would otherwise refrain from even sharing their data or statistics with, because there's this challenge and because there's this pressure that we observe. For the first time, the state is, or the government policymakers are trying to make contact with, let's say, the environmental activist groups, because they have no clue about how to start or where to start from, because they have been deprived of many policy tools over the decades as well. So in a way, they have been in contact with the researchers that are looking into, let's say, coal phase out, that are looking into the just transition impacts or the just transition elements in the deprived regions, on the possibly deprived regions. So it's the first time perhaps that we could have an opportunity where the state realizes its importance, or the policymakers realize their importance in terms, and their strategic importance in terms of coordinating these policies. And the last one is, of course, linkages. I've shown you the Turkish example of a country which loses its linkages throughout its course of growth dynamics. But then these are new technologies, right, that would be associated with new skills, new ways of learning, and then being able to, or having the ground, or having the potential to be able to construct many linkages. Of course, there are obstacles to transformation. The colleagues here in UNCTAD, working with individual countries, see how these obstacles are being realized. And therefore, I think it's very important that you work uniquely with each and every country, understanding their conditions and understanding their potential to achieve this transformation. So lastly, I would like to mention the communicating of this industrial policy, because what I think is many countries now are in need of having some form of starting point or some form of ground in terms of starting to think about the policies for this green transition. It might be due to an international pressure like the carbon border adjustment mechanism. It might be due to the forces that are coming from within domestically. But I think it's basically a very fearsome and we're talking, and sorry, and we're talking about a situation where the states are now really willing to accept any help that they could get in terms of where to start, in terms of crunching the numbers, what have you. So therefore, I think the role that we have here as researchers, as the ones in the policy institutions and in the academia is crucial, because we need to come up with starting points, and we need to come up with some numbers, and we need to come up with some paths, description of some paths for this policy. So I find it very important and beneficial, be it very simple as a starting point to discuss, as the exercises that were carried out by Pauline, for instance. He looks into what might be the cost of this whole green transition of the energy systems globally, right? So we need clean energy transformation, we need energy efficiency. What's the cost of that, right? So he cites a couple of data sources, he carries out some heuristics, and then comes up with a number that says, well, in order to be able to transform the energy systems of the global economy through energy efficiency and renewable energy, clean renewable energy transformation, what we need actually, what the global economy needs actually, is basically 2.5% of the global GDP annually. Right? So that's a number that gives a good starting point to discuss. Well, I think we should be able to generate different numbers for different countries as well. In a way, again, this is in the reference that I have listed before coming here. Again, in the same article, Pauline also looks into the country input-output tables, and he identifies the current level of domestic content for the activities that are to be taken for clean energy investments. Now, what do I mean by that? Suppose you're looking into the solar industry investments in Brazil. First, he goes and looks into, well, if the solar industry in Brazil is going to attract some investment, is going to start producing, what is the domestic content in the sectors that are involved? So you really need to have the construction sector being involved. You really need to have the computer and electronics products to be involved, the business sector services to be involved, the machinery and equipment services sector to be involved, and the basic metals manufacturing for the need of the solar panels are involved, right? So you can trace this throughout these input-output flows or linkages, and then who looks into the domestic content of that. What if there will be solar investment for solar panels in Brazil? Now, Brazil is at the top of the table. So what he looks into is that the solar is the one that is on the right? So already the domestic content of the solar panel investment is high in Brazil. It's on the order of 90%. So if you would like to stimulate the renewables energy transition in Brazil, you observe that almost 90% is already domestically produced through domestic linkages. Okay. Even if you depend on imports, even if you depend on the strategic imports in order to stimulate this production of solar panels, it is still going to be more than 80% dependent on the domestic industry. So you can then go through all these employment multipliers, income multipliers, and the forward and backward multipliers to see the impact of initiating a solar or wind turbine or this renewable energy transition in Brazil, and you can do it for many countries. Well, the result gives us a good starting point to discuss. We did a similar study for Turkey, for the energy sector, and we looked into if Turkey were to adopt a net zero emissions, net zero 2050 path, which was not on the agenda when we started this project, but we looked into the current available technologies. So we really did not go into the carbon capture and storage, the green hydrogen, or what have you. but we have basically focused on the period between 2020 and 2030, focused on different sectors that Professor Grubb was mentioning yesterday, but I'm just going to show you the electricity production sector. And we calculated what needs to be changing, right? So this graph, for instance, shows you the changes in installed capacity in the electricity sector. So given the current base path or given the official forecasts about how the electricity sector in Turkey is going to evolve, we calculated the difference between that and the difference that we need in terms of the capacity installments for this net zero transition. And of course, not surprisingly, you would need a huge investment for solar wind storage, and you would also like to decrease your programs or your official estimates in terms of coal and lignite. And you would still need some installments in terms of natural gas for the flexibility requirements. But then we have also calculated the additional costs along with the additional benefits, but I'm just going to show you the costs here. The investment cost for this capacity installments, the operational and maintenance cost, and the fuel cost. Actually, you see that the fuel cost is negative because Turkey is a huge importer of oil and gas. So if you rely less on the oil and gas for the electricity production, you get a negative number for the fuel cost, as well as the operations and maintenance cost, because actually coal-fired power plants and gas-fired power plants are actually costly to maintain as opposed to the renewables. But then, of course, you would need some new investment costs in terms of this capacity installments, right? So in total, the additional capacity and storage investment accounts for almost $35 billion along a period of 10 years. You get some negative numbers for operations and maintenance and fuel costs, and then all these grid costs, reproduction, renewables curtailment costs, all these technical costs that are associated with having this much of renewables in your grid system. And then you have to also have some investments in your grid system, which in the end accounts for almost $30 billion and over a course of 10 years. Annually, in annual terms, this is less than 0.5% of the Turkish GDP, which is also less than the total fuel subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies that the country is actually actively giving right now. So I think, well, before we started the project and while we were conducting the project, these numbers, before we generated these numbers, everyone's perception was that it would be extremely costly for a country, Turkey, to transform its energy system, to move into the renewables. We cannot do that. Our grid system will not be able to cope with that, etc. Right? So these numbers, well, what is the gain in terms of emissions? Well, if Turkey changes its energy system in a way that is consistent with this net zero path, the gains over the course of 10 years is actually really high. It's higher than 550 million tons of carbon dioxide, which is almost equal to the annual carbon dioxide emissions of the country. So over the course of 10 years, of course. So I think crunching numbers, be it a heuristic way, be it the very simplest way, it doesn't have to be a very complicated system of energy system, a model of energy systems, a model of economy. It doesn't have to be an integrated assessment models, but I think many governments now are in need of these numbers to be able to start a policy discussion with. So I think in that sense, what the colleagues here in UNCTAD are doing is extremely valuable. So I think I'll start here and leave the floor for Rashmi. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for showing us, illustrating so neatly the power of crunching numbers in a simple way, which is simple in its result, maybe not necessarily in the process of producing that result sometimes, but you're quite right. And I thank you for making that point so clearly. Please, Rashmi, over to you for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Ursula, and thank you very much, Professor, for this very interesting and very enlightening presentation. You started with the right questions. You talked about the declining productivity, labor productivity, the deindustrialization that is taking place, the manufacturing value added share, which is falling in many developing countries. And you also brought in a very important element of the need to look at classical model, which is really based on development and the state capacity. And bringing the Turkey's example, I think it's very important to look at country, because every country is unique and you need unique solutions for the countries. On the industrial policy of the future, while you talked a lot about the greening of the industrial policy, I think developing countries are facing many more challenges today. And one big challenge is how to have a digital transformation. And when I say digital transformation, I really am looking at how do you digitally transform the way you produce your output. So what you produce, how you produce, for whom you produce, all these elements, all these answers to these questions are changing. The all the factors of production, when you look at CLEMS, your capital, labor, energy, material, services, we have to relook at them now, because we need to bring digital content in industrial production. We now, if you look at, uh, if someone asks me what should be the design for industrial policy of future, I would say that the countries will have to start designing green digital industrial policies. Now, what could be the elements of these green digital industrial policies? Uh, I think, is it stuck? Okay, thank you. So, in one sentence, if I have to say, what is digital industrial revolution? What was this fourth digital industrial revolution? I would say that it was the rapid rise of digital content in industrial production. And this digital content increased in all three stages of production, whether it was a pre-production stage, where we are now using big data analysis to see where the demand is going to be. We should not have overcapacity. What is going to be demanded, that all comes out from the big data analysis. We need cloud computing, we need data intelligence. Then in the production stage, we need there is a huge deployment of industrial robots. Now robots, they don't fall sick, they work 24/7. There are no unions, no strikes. So the whole labor market is changed. Low cost labor, which was a selling USP for developing countries, to link into global value chain, it's disappearing very rapidly. So developed countries are not looking at forging, linking into the value chains or bringing developing countries into their value chains, because they have a low labor cost, which can contribute to the production, to their production of the final output. No, because they have a whole army of industrial robots now working. And because of all these complexities that exist in labor markets are no longer there for the advanced countries, they are anticipating an excess capacity, because the robots, they will be they will be doing mass production. And then it is not just their own markets they are looking at, they're also looking at markets of the developing countries now. Also, there's going to be 3D printing manufacturing. I'll come to more detailed discussion on 3D printing, because we have in this mind 3D printing is something manufacturing of the future. But no, it's happening now. Like we know that 3D houses are being built, 3D printed clothes are being made. There's so many products now which are 3D printed. And what is this 3D printing doing? There is a new technology which is called sintering, where the 3D printers can do mass production of customized products 100 times faster than ordinary machines. So what does that entail for developing countries in future? If I have to wear a dress instead of looking at the uh, my domestic stores, instead of going online and ordering from Amazon, next thing will be I will be ordering my dress. I want a red color dress. This should be the size. I want a matching bag, and this is my size. And this is the shoes I want, and then 3D printed. That's how it's going to be. And where does the competitive advantage in textile and clothing that we are all so happy to have, where does that go? So the whole landscape of industrial production is changing very, very rapidly. And this is the reason why we have to look at how should we be prepared for industrial policy of future, which is a digital industrial policy, also which talks to our climate goals, which is also a green industrial digital policy. Just to give you some numbers, because we are all researchers over here, we tried to see what is this digital divide all about. So we used world input output database, we used Leontief decomposition, and we used R, and we looked at what is the value added of computer programming and digital services in manufacturing output and manufacturing exports. And I need to update this, but what we found was that in developing countries it is stagnant, while in developed countries it is growing very rapidly. Now, this is what the digital divide is. So this is an empirical evidence of the growing digital divide, and this is how it is going to affect all our countries. Now, what should the industrial policy do? We cannot look at industrial policy in silo now. We cannot say digital transformation is the job of the Ministry of ICT, climate change is a job of Ministry of Environment, and industrial production is a job of industrial policy. We cannot have that luxury any longer. All ministries have to work together because all challenges are interlinked, and there has to be a comprehensive response to digital transformation, to climate change, and to the way we build our own competitiveness. So the first step would be to have a well functioning digital infrastructure. Now, digital infrastructure is no longer just ICT infrastructure. So if you look at digital infrastructure like a pyramid, then ICT infrastructure is just the base. Then we have, after that, we have digital skills, we have cloud computing infrastructure, broadband infrastructure, but more important, we have data infrastructure. And what is this data infrastructure? This is collection of data, processing of data, taking out data intelligence, and then using that data intelligence in the digital technologies. So when we talk about AI, artificial intelligence, where are we? Where are the developing countries in terms of developing its artificial intelligence? We have to catch up, and we don't have much time to catch up. So digital over here, we can leave ICT infrastructure to the Ministry of ICT, but the industrial policy has to start looking at data infrastructure and how to have data intelligence processed, and then how to use digital technologies. Here, when you talk about data infrastructure, the core is data. We know that, and we have been talking about data is the new oil, only because it was not the oil producing countries which really industrialized. It was the oil processing in countries. It was the industries which used processed oil in their manufacturing, which developed. Similarly, it is not the data generating countries who are going to all, if you have big population, more data, you are going to develop more. No. It is the countries who have the capacities to process data, to use the data intelligence in their digital technologies. They are the ones who are going to be digitally transformed. And I think this should be the first step of every industrial policy, how to develop the capacities of collecting data, processing data, and setting up data centers, because data centers are your new factories where you will process data and where you will be able to then use data. Now, coming to building data centers, we know data is generated every second. So there will be a need for data storage, and therefore data centers are very important. They are the new factories. They will expand. The more the digital technologies are used, the more will be the demand for data centers. Now, when we say how do you marry climate goals to industrial policy or digital industrial policies, the data centers which are coming out now are using water, solar, and wind energy. So they are green data centers. They are small in size, because earlier the narrative was that data centers use a lot of electricity, a lot of energy. So it's very costly. But no, the new data centers are very green, very cost effective, and they are closer to the consumers. It is also very important to look at, how data centers are increasing productivity and the market reach of the countries. Now, is there any country who has been successfully digitally transformed itself? Yes, China. China was a developing country. It was an agrarian economy. I still remember talking about it as an assembly hub. And here, I think in UNCTAD, we had this whole discussion how $100 which China exports, only $1 goes to China because it's an assembly hub. Then it became a manufacturing hub, and everything was manufactured in China. But we said, no, China is making and selling it to Apple or to other brands. So it is not branding, it is just manufacturing. And the entire profit goes to the one who brands. But today, China has become a digital leader. And I will share with you just a few policies, one or two slides on China. But we have this publication on structural transformation of China, what can developing countries learn? And here we have looked at in detail the macro financial policies adopted by China, trade policies, industrial policies, as well as digital policies which China put in place, but it was all done in a comprehensive manner. It wasn't one-off policy. So there was this kind of concept which China adopted. It was to address both demand and supply constraint. There was a big push for intranet infrastructure. There was a big push to, and acceleration of deep integration of internet into the real economy. This is where the industrial policy needs to focus. Then how to enhance the capacities, and then sector specific policies. Again, this is where the industrial policy will focus, sector specific policies. And just to give you a flavor of it, how just one part of it, which is accelerating the deep integration of intranet with real economy, these were the policies which were put in place. So this policy is focusing on entrepreneurship, on innovation, on energy, on finance, on e-commerce, on transportation, green ecology, artificial intelligence, all together. And China did not do it overnight. It took many years, and it also encountered many failures, but it learned from its failures. Then coming to, I will not go into the details because of the limitation of time, but it is very interesting to see that it was not just designing of the policy, even in implementation, they were very successful. And there are numbers to show how successful they were in terms of implementing these policies. If you look at data centers, if you look at their cloud computing infrastructure, broadband infrastructure, we see now today China has emerged as a global digital leader. And US and China, they account for 75% of all patents related to blockchain technologies. Even on green technologies, these two countries are the leader. 50% of global spending on IoT, more than 75% of cloud computing market, and 90% of market capitalization value of world's 70 largest digital platform companies is shared between US and China. And now we know why there is so much of US-China geopolitical issues. Apple has now become a $2 trillion company, which is more than the GDP of 82% countries of the world. So this is a very striking figure. If you come to think of it, Apple is bigger than so many countries of the world. So it will drive your political agenda. It will drive the trade agenda. We know there are super platforms, and developing countries now really have a very genuine and serious risk of becoming providers of raw materials, not just commodity dependent. It's not just commodities, it is raw materials of digital economy as well, data, raw materials of climate resilient economy as well, raw material of most of the uh, future economy. So 3D printing, I was talking about this 3D printing. I think this is again a game changer, and industrial policy needs to look at it very closely, develop their own capacities for 3D printing. And again, there is this whole debate on, whether electronic transmissions should be regulated or not at the WTO. And in UNCTAD, in our trade and development report, we have talked about the need for removal of the moratorium on custom duties on electronic transmissions. Because what are electronic transmissions? These are nothing but anything that comes on internet, via internet, that enters your economy. Anything and everything can enter via internet now, whether it is legal services, medical services, everything. Whether it is softwares, artificial intelligence, everything enters. So there is a need to regulate that. Developing countries also need to understand. They might put high tariff barriers. They might not take commitments in some sectors like construction services. But foreign firms just need to install a 3D printer and then bring in a software and 3D print whatever you want. You cannot stop them. You cannot regulate them, because you cannot regulate the software com- coming into your countries. So the debates are very complex now, and I think developing countries really need to understand what are the challenges which are being posed on their industrial production, on their industrialization. Again, I would say that uh, along with green industrial policies, digital industrial policies also need to be the focus for the developing countries. Clems has changed. All factors of production have changed. So what labor is now being, what are the labor markets for robots? What energy and materials are being used by the 3D printer? What digital services we need to develop? All these need to be the focus of the industrial policy. I think I'll stop there, and thank you very much. And I hope you're not really too disappointed with what governments need to do now. Thank you.